Micah Reed and the slap of truth. He raised his hand to correct a lie and was slapped by the sheriff. But then a federal official walked in and started clapping. Have you ever been in a school gym so crowded it felt like the air had been sucked out? That Friday morning at Lincoln High School in Maplewood, Georgia, the atmosphere was stifling, like prejudice itself was hanging thick in the air. The entire town had gathered for the Heroes Day Assembly, an annual event supposedly honoring first responders and outstanding students. But this time, that honor led to a shocking slap. Micah Reed, 15, stood in the front row, bright-eyed, sporting a fresh haircut, crisp white shirt, and neatly pressed khakis. From a distance, he looked like any honor student, but his gaze was quieter, sharper, as if he was bracing for something. His mother, Ms. Monica, was different that morning. She hadn't said much, just squeezed his hand tightly as she dropped him off at school. There was something in her eyes, a kind of instinctive foresight, not about the ceremony itself, but about what the ceremony might be hiding. A stage had been set up in the center of the gym. Under the lights were plastic bouquets, American flags, and nameplates of local heroes. But behind the red and white curtain lay a cold truth. Every single speaker invited was white. When Sheriff Dale Simmons walked out, the sound of his boots hitting the floor felt more threatening than ceremonial. He removed his sunglasses, eyes scanning the crowd like inspecting a regiment. You kids are the future, but the future starts with discipline and respect, he began. I grew up in a grateful America. Now people rewrite the past. They call cops the enemy. They claim this country was built on oppression. I find that laughable. His words struck the air like nails hammered into the wall. Some parents nodded approvingly, but a few teachers, especially Ms. Burney, gripped their chairs tightly. Micah swallowed. He knew what he was about to do wasn't safe, but he had never learned how to stay silent in the face of wrong. He raised his hand, just one hand, not rushed, not provocative. He simply couldn't let the distortion of truth slide by as cheerful commentary. Tension climbs with every second. What's going on, kid? Simmons looked at Micah like a child lost on a battlefield. Sir, may I just say one thing? Micah's voice was strangely calm. History isn't something to choose based on emotion. And the slave economy, especially in the South, wasn't a footnote in American history. It was foundational. A student held their breath. A teacher dropped their binder. Simmons frowned. You're challenging me? No, sir. I'm challenging inaccuracy. You trying to teach me about America? I'm trying to remind us of the part of America you just left out. No one laughed. No one spoke. Everything stood still until Simmons stepped off the stage. The slap wasn't just for a boy. He stopped directly in front of Micah, close enough that his breath, sour with cheap coffee, was audible. Micah stood tall. You know who's talking here, boy? Micah nodded. A powerful man avoiding the truth. The slap came like thunder. Micah's left cheek turned red. His glasses flew off. The sound echoed like a dry gunshot in a closed room. A moment of stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Phones flipped up. Cameras raised. A girl started crying. A teacher yelled, "What the hell did you just do?" Micah staggered back half a step, but didn't fall. Didn't cry. His cheek burned. His glasses were on the floor, but his eyes remained fixed. Wet, not from pain, but from the searing sting of humiliation. And then, a single clap rang out. Not from the front rows, but from the very back of the gym. A sharp, commanding sound like a starter pistol. No one had noticed the black car parked outside the gate that morning. Brookshire had been sent a short video by an anonymous student just 3 minutes before she appeared. 1, 2, 3 claps. Slow, firm, unmistakable. The packed gym seemed to lose all its air. Every eye turned. Even Simmons froze, as if an invisible hand gripped his collar. The double doors at the rear swung open. Angela Brookshire walked in. No introduction was needed. Tall, her footsteps silent, but weighted. Her Department of Defense Navy uniform was perfectly pressed, the lights catching the 4 silver stars glinting on her left chest. She didn't have to say a word. The room fell utterly silent. 2 plainclothes officers followed behind her like shadows. Not bodyguards, witnesses. She walked straight toward the podium, where just 2 minutes earlier, a child had been slapped across the face for speaking the truth. Micah was still standing there, his eyes wide, chest rising and falling, but not a single tear had fallen. Only a clenched fist, not for fighting back, but to keep from breaking down. Brookshire looked at Simmons, then at Micah. Finally, she turned to the crowd and spoke. "It is exactly because of what just happened that I'm here." Simmons narrowed his eyes. "No one told me you'd be attending," he said, his voice sharpening. Brookshire didn't respond immediately. She just tilted her head slightly, like an eagle silently surveying prey beneath its talons. "That much is clear," she said, each word etched into the wooden floor. The entire auditorium held its breath. No one moved. Some students forgot to breathe altogether. "I'm Angela Brookshire, Lincoln High alum, class of '92. I'm not here to hand out medals. I'm here because a child was assaulted, not on the street, but in the very school he was taught was safe." Simmons began to react. "Wait, you misunderstood." Brookshire raised a single finger. He fell silent. One gesture. Just one. "What did you do? Slap a black student for speaking the truth? At a ceremony about heroes? And you thought there would be no consequences?" Miss Burney gripped her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Some teachers began recording. Parents looked at each other, still shocked, but no longer afraid. "I've served in 3 military campaigns. I've endured rockets, gunfire, and the disdain of allies. But never, never have I felt the kind of fury I did watching you strike a child for speaking up." Principal Denton stammered, "The Department of Education, will handle this internally." Brookshire cut in. "There is no internal when the entire country is watching. There's no misunderstanding when 3 cameras are recording from different angles." She stepped down the stairs and walked over to Micah. He stood still, didn't flinch. She looked at him. "Are you okay, child?" He nodded, barely a breath. Brookshire took a handkerchief from her uniform pocket and handed it to him. "You just taught this entire room a lesson no textbook ever could, and you made me proud." Micah's mother, Monica, in the crowd, no longer held back her tears. She clutched her chest, trying not to scream. It was pain transforming into pride. Simmons tried to slip backstage, but security guards were already posted at both sides. No one said a word to him. They didn't have to. The silence alone told him that this time, he was the one being held, not in cuffs, but in consequence. That afternoon, someone threw a scorched old piece of cloth, a Confederate flag, onto Micah's front lawn. A message without words. Its colors alone made clear what was boiling beneath the town's surface. Monica called the police. She called 3 times. The first call was disconnected midway. The second was rerouted to a pending case line. By the third, a cold male voice answered, "You'll need to be patient. We've got more pressing matters than a piece of burnt cloth." It took nearly 3 hours for anyone to arrive. When they did, the officer who stepped out turned out to be an old classmate of Simmons. He didn't carry a notebook, didn't ask many questions, only said, "We're following protocol. You understand? The situation's delicate." Micah looked at his mother. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled like holding a cracked glass cup. That night, she made Micah sleep in her room. No explanation. Just to be sure. Meanwhile, the local school board scrambled to contain the fallout. An emergency meeting was held where the superintendent read a statement as cold as a scrolling ticker. "We regret the incident that occurred on school grounds. An independent investigation is underway." No names mentioned, not a single apology. The word incident became a bitter joke among faculty, as if a child being slapped on stage was equivalent to a power outage during class. At school, the air felt like a guitar string wound too tight. Some teachers chose silence, but Ms. Burney, still wearing her Black Lives Matter pin on her collar, stood up the very next day and taught the First Amendment louder and clearer than ever. In the teacher's lounge, a gym coach, formerly a police officer, defended Simmons loudly and ended by yelling at the janitor. "That boy was raised wrong." The janitor only said, "He slapped a child. That's all." Another art teacher quietly cleaned her glasses and said, "I thought this kind of thing wouldn't happen anymore, that we'd move past it." The teacher next to her shook their head. We never moved past it. We just learned how to look away. Lunchtime became a mini battlefield. Some students called Micah the truth speaker. Others claimed he was blowing it all up to get attention. A senior girl posted online, "He disrespected an adult. Don't expect me to sympathize just because of his skin color." The post was screenshotted and spread like wildfire. Comments poured in like a hailstorm. Within hours, she was forced to deactivate her account. Online, the parents were just as divided. The Moms of Maplewood Facebook group turned into a war zone. One person wrote, "This is violence from someone in power. Plain and simple." Another replied, "We teach our kids to respect adults. That boy should have known better." 10 comments later, the word Kaepernick appeared, and that was it. It exploded. But Brookshire didn't back down. 2 days later, she held a press conference right in front of Lincoln High's gate. No backdrop, no staging. A child was hit for daring to speak the truth. Don't call that discipline. That's abuse. And if we don't recognize it as such, then we're complicit. A reporter shouted, "Are you calling for the sheriff to resign?" "I'm calling for accountability, not the nod and move on kind. I want action." That afternoon, the police department released a statement. Simmons did not admit fault. He simply said he was sorry things went too far and that he acted on instinct to maintain order. Instinct, as if that child was a threat. But the real threat waited outside Micah's home. After dark, strange cars drove slowly past. Someone threw a water bottle that shattered at the base of the wall, then sped off. Monica didn't sleep. She sat behind the curtain, clutching a flashlight tightly in her hand. By Monday morning, Maplewood felt like it had been split in half with a dull knife. One side called Micah a hero. The other whispered, he should know his place. The divide wasn't just racial, it was psychological. Some friends who were once close fell silent. Some who were once hesitant now spoke out in support. At Earl's barbershop, where gossip spread faster than the news, the air was taut. Big Reggie said loudly, "If that were my grandson, I'd be in jail right now." Earl replied, eyes never leaving the scissors. "And what would that change?" In the corner, Mr. Landry, a veteran who'd lived in town for 50 years, slowly shook his head. "We can't fight them with fists. We have to use truth, and we have to let the world see just how scared they are of that truth." On the other side of town, Mason's coffee shop was quieter, but just as heavy with whispers. A group of church women sat around the pastry table. "We don't know the whole story. Maybe that boy should have stayed quiet." Another woman cut in, "But he slapped a child." That sentence hung in the air like a weight. No one responded. That night, Mayor Hollings held a town hall. The auditorium was packed, people spilling out onto the steps. "I know this is a sensitive time. Simmons is someone I've known for 2 decades. Monica Reed stood up. No microphone, no permission. "And I've known my son for 15 years, from the day he was born to the day he was struck. And you call that sensitive? I call that cowardice." The school became a glass box. Micah walked into class and everyone whispered. Some praised him, some mocked. Some looked at him like an uncomfortable reminder. At lunch, Micah sat across from Andre, one of the few friends who hadn't changed. Andre shook his juice box and said quietly, "You know you just peeled the cover off their dream, right?" "What dream?" "That this town is fair. You woke them up. And that scares them." Micah nodded silently. "I didn't mean to become the center of anything." Andre looked up from his lunch tray, brow furrowed. "And that's exactly why you did." Micah shrugged. "Trouble isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's the only thing left when everyone else chooses silence." That night, Micah couldn't sleep. Not from fear. He had looked fear in the eye, and it hadn't won. But because, for the first time, he felt like just one link in something much bigger. Something that didn't end in this little town. His name appeared next to phrases he never imagined would be connected to him. Peaceful protest, citizen awakening, teen justice icon. Micah was only 15. All he wanted was to speak the truth. But truth, as always, isn't easy to hear, especially when it comes from a black boy. Meanwhile, at the police department, Simmons walked in holding a plastic cup of coffee, cold, like his face, as if nothing had happened. No explanation, no sign of remorse. But his denial no longer held power. 3 deputies suddenly called in sick, citing emotional distress. A records clerk quietly packed up her desk, leaving behind a resignation letter with no farewell. The town council convened an emergency meeting, private, unannounced, to assess the level of public backlash risk to the law enforcement agency. Calls from parents poured in. "My child won't go to a school where the truth is punished." "A sheriff slapped a student? If that were my kid, he'd be in jail." But in Maplewood, a southern town, putting a sheriff on trial wasn't easy. Simmons wasn't just a man in power, he was the system. That's when Angela Brookshire returned, this time with no cameras, no microphones. Just her and a group of gray-suited attorneys entering City Hall through the back door. No one heard what was said, but the next morning at exactly 9 a.m., a short notice was released. Sheriff Dale Simmons has been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending investigation. No video, no personal statement. He simply vanished, like a blot of ink quietly erased from the record. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he'd hired a lawyer from Atlanta. Others swore they saw him alone at a roadside bar, mumbling about the radicals in this traitor town. But attention didn't fade, it surged. Micah received letters from across America, from a retired teacher in Wisconsin, from a group of students in the Bronx, from an elderly woman in Selma who'd been arrested in 1965. She wrote, "You reminded me why we stood up in the first place." Of course, there were also hate messages, anonymous death threats, but most were messages of support and gratitude. Micah stayed silent until the community forum. Held in the same place where it all began, Lincoln High's gymnasium. This time the seats were packed not for medals or titles, but out of a hunger to hear what the boy who was slapped would say when he stood up again. Micah hadn't planned to speak, but when the moderator read his name and all eyes turned toward him, he stood, slowly, steadily, as if walking a path with no return. "Hi everyone, I'm Micah Reed, 15 years old." He looked straight into the crowd. No one interrupted. No one rushed. "I don't have anything to prove. I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm not looking for fame. I just think when a student asks a question, especially about history, adults should listen, not strike." A few nods, a quiet yes from the crowd. "It's sad that people are arguing over whether I had the right to speak truth, instead of discussing what actually happened. I was hit. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. The way adults said, maybe he crossed the line. If speaking the truth is considered crossing a line, then maybe truth itself needs someone to stand for it. He stepped away from the microphone. No grand closing, no dramatic pause. The applause started small, then rippled like waves breaking on the shore. Afterward, Monica hugged her son tightly, longer than any time he could remember. "You didn't just stand up," she whispered in his ear. "You stood tall, and you made them look." Micah smiled, not because it was over, but because now he knew he wasn't alone. At Lincoln High, things didn't go back to normal, because normal was no longer something anyone wanted. History class was no longer quiet. Students began asking more questions, sometimes as sharp and simple as, "Why doesn't the textbook talk about that? Who gets to write history? And who gets left out?" Teachers no longer taught as if truth were fixed. They started asking questions alongside their students. And Mr. Franklin, the school counselor, no longer just did administrative paperwork. He launched a monthly forum where students could say things even adults were afraid to admit. The first topic, is respect the same as obedience? Micah always sat in the front row, not to stand out, but because no one could forget the face that was once slapped for asking a question. He was no longer just a student, he was a crack in the wall, a reminder that truth never comes free. But there was one thing no one saw. Micah still flinched when someone slammed a door too hard. He still couldn't sleep deeply. And every time someone asked for an interview, he turned to his mother. "Mom, did this all go too far?" Monica set her teacup down on the porch rail, eyes on the orange-tinged sky. "No, baby, some people shout to get attention. But you made people look at what they used to avoid. Those two things are very different." Micah didn't respond. He just nodded, eyes drifting toward the horizon, letting her words settle like rain after a storm. Later, the town gave him a certificate, a ceremony, and a scholarship from a long-forgotten foundation. But what he remembered most wasn't the spotlight or applause. It was a cloudy afternoon, weeks later. A boy named Noah, quiet, shy, often bullied for his speech impediment, walked up to Micah as he was packing up his books after school. He didn't start a conversation like everyone else. He simply said, Thank you." Micah looked surprised. "For what?" Noah shrugged, eyes fixed on the floor. "Because I thought we weren't allowed to say anything, but that day you showed me. We can." Micah smiled. "We always can. They just make us believe we shouldn't." That night, he wrote those words on a sticky note and placed it on his mirror, right next to the photo of him shaking hands with Secretary Brookshire. That summer, Brookshire returned. No press, no entourage, just a visit in the truest sense. She and Micah walked the halls of Lincoln High. The old class photos hanging on the walls stood like silent witnesses. "You've shaken this place," she said, walking slowly. Micah shrugged. "I didn't mean to." Brookshire chuckled. The biggest changes usually come from those who weren't trying to change anything at all. Before leaving, she handed him a book. Worn cover, folded pages, lines underlined in both bold and faded ink. James Baldwin. "Read this, and when someone tells you to stay silent, you'll know what to do, won't you?" Micah didn't answer. He just nodded. Because no words were needed, he understood. This story wasn't just about a sheriff or a SLAP. It was about power, and how power behaves when questioned. It was about fear, and how people build rules to preserve silence. It was about raised hands and who claps and who turns away.